everyone, it's Miss Seward, and today we're going to be doing notes on section 2.1, which is about Introduction to Biodiversity. And our learning objective for today is going to be explain the levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. The skill that you're going to have by the end of this is to be able to describe environmental concepts and processes. And throughout these notes, you're going to learn about biodiversity, the different types of biodiversity, populations, and how biodiversity is impacted by stressors and things like habitat loss or just different trends that we see when it comes to biodiversity in ecosystems. So we're going to start with some basics about biodiversity and the different levels that we look at when it comes to biodiversity in ecosystems. So typically we're going to be measuring it on 3 different levels. The first level is going to be ecosystem diversity, and this is going to be the number of different habitats available in a given area. So if you look at this picture up here on the top where we're looking at ecosystem diversity, in here you're going to see that we have like an ocean ecosystem, a beach ecosystem, a forest ecosystem, more of like a mountain ecosystem. So we have different types of habitats in this area that we're looking at. Now, the second type of level that we're going to look at is species diversity. And this is going to be the number of different species in an ecosystem and the balance or evenness of the population sizes that we see in these species in that ecosystem. So maybe if we zoomed in here to look at the forest ecosystem in this first picture, we would see different types of species. We would see like a woodpecker, tree, ferns, mushroom, we've got a chipmunk, we've got a bear, and a bunch of other different types of species. So we're looking at the species diversity of this ecosystem. And then the third part is going to be looking at the genetic diversity. And this is specifically how the different genes of individuals are in a population. Remember that a population is a group of the same species. So for example, if we were to look at this chipmunk within this forest ecosystem and look at all the chipmunks in the population in this forest, all of them are going to be genetically different just because individuals have their own unique genes. So we're going to see some genetic diversity within this chipmunk population, just due to the natural genetic DNA differences of these individuals. Now, the important thing to remember with biodiversity is that the higher biodiversity we have, we're going to have a higher health of the ecosystem and that population. So high biodiversity means higher health. And we'll dive into the reasoning behind that throughout these notes. Now, one of the things that we look at when we're looking at species is this metric called species richness, which you will sometimes see referred to by an R. Now, the richness is just going to be the total number of different species that are found in an ecosystem. And generally, a high R value is going to be a good sign of your ecosystem health, because the more species you have is going to be the more quality resources that you have. Things like water or soil nutrients or the different types of foods that are available. It's going to mean that you can have a wide variety of species in that ecosystem. Now, the second metric that we look at is called evenness. And this is going to be a measure of how all of the individual organisms in an ecosystem are balanced between the different species. So evenness is going to indicate if there's going to be 1 or 2 dominant species, or if the population sizes are generally well balanced. So if you're seeing like a ton of one species, but only a tiny bit of other species, it might be rich, but it wouldn't be even. So we can look at this example here with 2 different communities in a forest. Community 1 and 2 are going to have the same species richness, but they're going to have different species evenness. So like you look at both of these communities and they have 4 different types of trees in this forest. Now, community 1, though, they're all evenly distributed. So you have balanced evenness in this community 1. Community 2, though, has different species evenness, because if you look, this kind of yellower tree is going to have a much higher number than some of the other species here. So you have the same number of species richness, but you're going to have different species evenness in these two communities. So one of the other big important takeaways when it comes to talking about biodiversity is the idea that genetic diversity is going to be really beneficial. And genetic diversity is going to be a measure of how different the genomes are, the set of genes, in the individuals within a population of a given species. So remember, thinking back to your biology classes, you are going to have genetic diversity in all different populations just because of random mutations when DNA is copying, or when you have different sex cells from parents combine, they're going to have different chromosome combinations and crossing over, and different genes represented from the parental DNA that's coming in. So just the way that DNA and sex cells work, you are going to naturally have a lot of variety in individuals in a population. And so this is going to lead to new traits in offsprings. So the more genetic diversity that you have in a population means the better this population can respond to an environmental stressor like a drought or a disease or a famine. So the more genetic diversity that you have, it means that it's the higher of a chance you have that some of the individuals in the population are going to have traits that allow them to survive the environmental stressor. Maybe they're able to better survive drought, like it's a plant species that has a random mutation where they hold on to more water. Or maybe they're going to be resistant to a disease. The more diversity that you have in the genetics means the higher likelihood that just randomly these individuals will be able to survive a stressor that comes along. And one example that we can look at here is going to be with a disease called potato blight. So if we're looking at a really diverse population of potatoes, if this is your original crop here, if blight hits and it comes and maybe only one of the species of potatoes is going to be susceptible to this strain of blight. So blight comes and it's going to take out that one species. However, we've still got like 4 other species here. So after the disease, we might have lost one, but we still are going to have greater diversity just because of the slight genetic variance in the individuals in this population of potatoes. Now, if we look at cloned potatoes, which is going to be what happens with agricultural potatoes, so farmers are going to find a specific type and strain that grows easily, makes big potatoes. They're going to breed it so that they're all as identical as possible to each other. If potato blight comes and hits this population, it's going to wipe out all of them. So after the disease, you're not going to have survival because you didn't have that genetic diversity. We also have something that is called a bottleneck event, and this is going to be an environmental disturbance, something like a natural disaster or human habitat destruction, that is going to drastically reduce the population size in a population, and it's going to kill organisms regardless of their genome. So this is not going to be like, oh, you happen to be resistant to a disease. It's going to be something random like a hurricane just hits one side of your island, and so half of you die, which had nothing to do with your genetics. Now, what this ends up creating is that the surviving population is going to be smaller, and because individuals just died randomly, this smaller population doesn't represent the genetic diversity of the original population. So if you're imagining, the reason we call it a bottleneck is if you kind of envision like a bottle here, if you've got your original population that's diverse, you have this bottlenecking event that just wipes out a random chunk. Just by chance, the ones that are left are not going to be as diverse as the original population. So the surviving population that you're left with is going to have less genetic diversity just because they were the ones that were left after this event occurred. So what ends up happening is a bottleneck event is going to reduce genetic diversity in that population. And because this population is smaller and it's less genetically diverse, it's going to be even more vulnerable to future environmental disturbances. So if a disease comes in after this hurricane, they're going to be less genetically able to potentially be able to survive that. So we can look at an example here with mice. Let's say that our original population is all these different types. You've got 50% white, 10% brown, 40% black in the coloring of these mice. Now let's say a hurricane comes and hits the city where they are living, and these types of mice happen to be in a cave that was protected from this hurricane. Now your next population is going to have 0% white, even though that was originally 50% of the original population. So you're going to have a different distribution here in these species. They're going to start meeting with each other, and your offspring are going to be less genetically diverse. Now, the reason why it is a problem if you are less genetically diverse is because this leads to inbreeding depression. So inbreeding is going to be when organisms mate with closely related family members. Fun fact, the science of inbreeding is why it is not legal to marry family members, because of what I'm about to explain to you in a second. Now, inbreeding is a problem because it leads to a higher chance of offspring having harmful genetic mutations because they're getting really similar genotypes from both parents. So if we were to look at this pedigree chart here, if the smaller A allele here represents a recessive deleterious allele, which means it's like a harmful allele. If originally you had a parent who just had one copy of this, breeding with another one, it's a not very common allele, so the other animal that's being bred in here is not going to have this. You have more diversity in the offspring. However, if in these offspring you have like a sister mating with a brother and they both happen to have that allele, it's going to be much more likely that an offspring will end up with both of these alleles, so they will have this harmful genetic mutation because of inbreeding that occurred. Now, smaller populations are going to be more likely to experience inbreeding just because it's more difficult to find a non-related mates. Animals are not like aware necessarily of who their siblings are. They're just going to mate with who's around them. So if it's a smaller population, just by chance, it's going to be more likely that they are breeding with someone who has similar genetics to them because it's a sibling. Now, we actually saw this occur with a Florida panther. The Florida panther, their population decreased down to only 30 individuals in the 1900s because of hunting and habitat loss. And because they only had 30 individuals in their population, this led to inbreeding depression. So they ended up having traits like a kinked tail or heart defects or low sperm count or issues with their reproductive system. And so this genetic diversity ended up, or the low genetic diversity ended up leading to harmful genetic mutations. Now, this ended up being a success story for scientists because they had a really closely related relative in Texas. So in 1995, scientists brought in some of these pumas from Texas and had them mingle with the Florida panther population to introduce some more diversity. And now the Florida panther population is doing better and having less inbreeding problems. So we have this idea of ecosystem resilience. And resilience is going to be the ability of an ecosystem to return to its original conditions after a major disturbance, such as like a windstorm, fire, flood, humans coming in and cutting down a bunch of trees, disturbances like that. Now, the more species diversity you have, the higher species diversity is going to give you higher ecosystem resilience. And this is because having a higher amount of species diversity means that you have more plant species that can come in and repopulate disturbed ground. When you have plants moving in, this is going to anchor the soil. It's going to provide food. It's also going to provide habitat for animal species. So you can have organisms refilling in this disturbed area because there were a wide variety of species that could move in and start creating this habitat again. So an example, you can look at this picture. If we originally had a pretty healthy looking ecosystem, if you had like a hurricane that came in and damaged this ecosystem, it is still going to be able to be fine in the future if it has high species diversity and different organisms can come in and refill areas so that you can start creating habitat once again for organisms to live in. So now you're going to have your practice FRQ 2.1. The skill that you're going to practice is describing environmental concepts and processes. So what I want you to do is to describe one of the 3 levels of biodiversity and then explain how high biodiversity at the level you described is beneficial to ecosystems. So that will be your practice FRQ 2.1. Those were your notes for 2.1, which is Introduction to Biodiversity. And I hope that you learned something from it.